Professor Dan Honig has a tremendous new book, Mission-Driven Bureaucrats. He argues that efforts to improve public bureaucracies may actually be counterproductive, and by imposing strict rulebooks that can stifle innovation, autonomy and enthusiasm. Instead, we need to create empowering cultures that reward intrinsic motivation. Now, besides being a very accomplished academic, Professor Honig has the rare feat, Dan, of being the only person in the world to come on my podcast 4 times. This is your fourth.
Four times. 4 times.
Which is a reflection of my enthusiasm and intrinsic motivation for all things Dan. Okay,
Thank you so much,
Dan,
Alice.
welcome.
Thank you so much, Alice. It's such a joy to be here. Such a joy to go for 4.
Big
you know.
4. Okay,
Exactly.
now, okay. What do efforts to improve public sector bureaucracies usually get wrong?
We have seen managerial systems that seek to engage in compliance in an attempt to kind of avoid bad headlines, right? And force bureaucrats to do the things that, in the imagination of the creators of the systems, they don't want to do, right? But, to the work from Detroit that I have in the book, right? That very often undermines performance. So in the case of the book, what's in the book, I study child with co-authors. I study child protective services in Detroit, right? So these are people, so here in the UK, you'd call it children in care or whatnot, vulnerable children, right? So, and basically there's a system of rules, all of which are extremely reasonable on their face, right? So to prevent people from not focusing enough on each case, there's a caseload maximum, right? There's also a kind of a pretty strict accountability system, a strict punishment system, if anything bad happens to a child who is being investigated, right? But what happens as a result is that the child protective services officers on the front lines, they have every incentive to, in local parlance, pull children, to remove them from homes and put them in what I think everyone agrees is a woefully inadequate childcare, foster care system, right? As quickly as possible. And this means what we find is actually the more people care about helping children, the quicker those people leave the job, right? So that is to say, I care a lot about helping kids. I end up being a child protective services officer. I find that as a CPS officer, I cannot actually help children. And I say, you know what? I'm going to leave this job that I so wanted to do because I find that I can probably help kids somewhere else. Or if I'm not
Because the
gonna-
existing framework is so frustrating.
Because I feel I cannot actually accomplish what drew me to the job. I can't actually...
What are the major reasons? What are the things that they find frustrating? What's holding them back from being effective?
Yeah, so, there's just kind of a mountain of paperwork, and there's this incentive. So I have to clear a case to stay in compliance. They actually say the term in compliance. To stay in compliance with the case law.
So it's actually like The Wire, where it's all about statistics.
Yes, so it's all about, exactly, so like The Wire, it's good. That's Detroit on The Wire. Now we've got the important parts of the system on board. So, right, so like The Wire, I'm trying to meet my numbers, but here it's not like, I'm not turning like, in the case of The Wire, I don't know, assaults into minor assaults, felonies into misdemeanors. Here I'm not like gaming the system. What I'm trying to do is clear the cases. So I keep a number. So there's no like fictionalizing of the stats.
Right.
But there is a sense in which the need to be in compliance means I need to move as quickly as possible.
Yes.
And all the risk is on one side. If we think there are probably 2 kinds of errors, leaving a child in a home too long and pulling them too quickly, only one of those errors can compliance-based management help see.
Yes.
Right? And because of that, like Goldilocks, imagine if Goldilocks could only, I don't know, taste heat. She would end up with water that was too cold, right? Because she would react too much to one problem, not enough with the other.
I read that a child who does not live who lives with a non-biologically related male is 50 times more likely to experience some kind of accidental injury.
I don't know the reason to the question, but at least in America, the literature on foster care, I think, makes pretty clear. It's mostly observational.
Even if it's like, for example, if the mother has a boyfriend who's not the child's father.
Yeah.
And I imagine working in child protective services is a really tough and difficult job.
I have to say, part of, so, when I went and spoke to these specialists, these frontline workers, I found myself thinking again and again, I couldn't do this job.
Yeah, it's
like
harrowing.
It is an emotionally burdensome, it is a draining job that is likely to create burnout, whatever we do in terms of management. I'm not saying that, it is a high stress, high intensity job. But here are people willing to do this job, right? Despite those things, despite the fact that it frankly is not very well compensated, right? And all they want to do is help children. And we are setting up a system that keeps them from doing so.
And what would be, rather than say clear in your cases, what would be a better way of structuring child protection, for example?
Yeah, so I've been doing some work with an organization in Australia, New South Wales, called People in Care, or PIC, right? Led by a wonderful individual named Jared Wheatley. I'm sorry, Jared, for getting your surname wrong one way or the other. So, what they do, and what the government of New South Wales is considering moving towards a broad model of, is they basically try to center creating psychological safety for the child, right? So that is about sort of, the idea is that children who have been in these vulnerable situations are, the first thing they need to do is to learn how to trust and to feel safe and to stop feeling those kinds of reflexes of, sort of fight and flight, right? And how do you do that? Well, you do that with repeated contact with a care worker, right? You do that by creating a kind of relationship which centers sort of the holistic wellness of, if they have not yet been taken into care, the child and the family. Here in Camden, so we're sitting in my office in University College London now, in lovely Camden, right? And at Camden, they use an approach called family group counseling, or FGC. And what Camden does, led by Georgia Gould, who is soon to be a member of Parliament for the Labour Party, right? So she's been selected, right? So what Georgia and her council does is they look to support the holistic family, right? By creating long-term relationships well before intervention is needed. And, having attended some of these events, it seems very clear that there are at least some parents, right, for whom this works wonderfully and who end up creating a different kind of relationship with their...
So do they not have the targets, the numerical
That's
targets?
right. So they don't have numerical targets. And the goal is not sort of... and the kind of accountability system is not one-sided, right? It's not only looking at what happens to a child if they remain with their parents. It's looking at how the child thrives over the medium term. And, the other thing to say is, so as you know, I have some prior work that makes a distinction between what I call accounting-based and account-based accountability, right? And so accounting-based, of course, is what an accountant sees, right? So numbers, targets, things like that. Account-based is justification, it's narrative, it's understanding, right? And, the system in Camden really empowers the people at the front lines interacting with the parents to understand and report back what is happening and what an appropriate next course of action is.
Wow.
And so
you're saying here in London there's a good system?
There is.
Yay! I mean,
There
London
is.
has literally no good news, so
well,
that's a win.
this is a council. And so, and there are other examples too.
That's a win.
There are folks up in Gateshead, which is, I believe, just south of Newcastle. Correct me if I'm wrong, right? So
Look at you with your UK geography.
Well, what can I say? You keep me here for a few years and I learn a few things. Not that many, but one or two. And so, up in Gateshead, they have a kind of similar system. So they call it the liberated method, right? So now we're not talking about children in care. We're talking about vulnerable members of the larger community, right? So I have in mind a kind of, elderly, isolated person, right? Yes. And so it used to be the case that that person needed to have a diagnosed problem for their caseworker to then bring in a service to deliver to that person, right? And, the first step in the liberated method, as I understand it, was empowering those caseworkers and giving them some discretionary funding, right? So, if you seem a bit isolated and are maybe having trouble going to the store, before you're malnourished, right? Before, you feel totally socially isolated, I help you get a bus pass and take you to the store and go shopping with you, right? And, now you are more engaged, you see channels, right? And by allowing the caseworker to use judgment, even when there was no documentable problem that the system could see, that, accounting-based accountability could see yet, they have, I think in a pretty well-documented way, led to improve performance while saving a significant amount of money. Because of course, if you intervene at time t, rather than when things get worse 3 years down the line at t+3, right? It is in fact cheaper and, more importantly to my view, better for the citizen, right? Better for the person receiving services.
And in Camden, do they have lower staff attrition?
I actually don't know. It's a good question, and certainly a knowable one. But I don't know. I would
follow
imagine.
up on that for my listeners.
I will. I'll get back. We'll get back to you on the staff
Okay.
attrition.
My next question.
Yes,
okay.
yes.
What are the risks? Oh no, I think we. Oh yeah. How does management style affect the recruitment and development of mission-driven bureaucrats?
Yeah. So basically, like people, we were speaking earlier today, actually, about an academic and how the management environment they faced was influencing their desire to come to and remain at the workplace, right? And, I think that's true of academics and public sector workers and private sector workers, in fact, all people, right?
Yes,
so
yes.
that is to say, like, people want to work places where they feel valued, right? So the way I put in the book, managing for empowerment, I describe as management that allows autonomy, cultivates competence, and creates connections to peers and purpose, right? And when that's the case, more people want to come, and more people want to stay, and fewer people want to go, right? And indeed, we also see in sort of big data, right? So I put together the all publicly available data on civil service surveys, and I pre-register it. That is, I say beforehand what the analyses are going to be, and then I ask questions of it like, do perceptions of management practice, right, influence first job satisfaction? The answer, you'll be unsurprised to learn, is yes, right? When people don't like their managers, they are less happy at their jobs.
Yeah,
but what about this question that some of your I was going to say listeners, but watchers as well, listeners and watchers have encountered, which is intent to leave. Like, are you going to leave your employment, right? So, and what the data seems to show is that management practice matters more to intent to leave for people who care more about the job, people who are more mission motivated.
Right,
So
yes,
let me unpack that for a little bit. So let's take that Child Protective Services worker in Detroit, right? So that worker cares about helping children. If management keeps them from being able to help children, they're more likely to go. If management supports them in helping children, they're more likely to stay. They're more responsive in both senses, right? And, that seems to be true in observational data. And I should say, this bit is in the book. It's also published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. I have a paper there from a few years ago. How you're managed affects both selection in and selection out. As I put in the book, if you build it, they will come. To the extent that we think about management practice, we tend to think about management practice today on today's employees. But today's management practice is also about tomorrow's employees. Because tomorrow's employees are today's employees who stick around and the people who decide to enter.
Right, so this is the idea that, one, if you don't like your management, you'll be frustrated and unhappy, but also you're more likely to stay at a job if you're happy, if you feel like you can actually achieve things.
Sure.
If you feel like we're changing things, we're saving children's lives, we're making a difference in the world, and isn't this great, and I feel proud and happy.
Exactly.
I have a sense that, I'm making a positive contribution to the world.
100%.
Yay! And that's great, and that's an affirming feeling, and that's very important to people. And this resonates with my own work. When I was in rural Zambia, there were many nurses and midwives I was interacting with when I was working on maternal health, and they feel like that no one cares about their work, and they're just slogging, and they're working so hard, and no one notices. So why put in all these hours if no one cares? And so I was comparing these 3 different districts, where one had this manager who was very keen on maternal health, and he was providing supportive supervision. He was checking up on their work, he was looking at what they'd done, if they'd used the instruments correctly, and he was also saying, this is great, look what this team has done. And they felt so, and there was no difference in pay, there was no difference in any kind of seniority or system, but it was just an environment where they felt valued, where they felt appreciated, where they felt that someone was taking it seriously.
Totally.
And that district was totally similar to all the districts, but because it had this more supportive supervision, they massively reduced their maternal deaths. And that's a huge difference.
I love that. So let me pick up, if I could, on two things from that story. So the first is supportive supervision or empowering management or whatever. It's not letting people do whatever they want. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It is in fact active management, where the job of the manager is to help you do what you are doing, rather than to police you, right? To constrain you, I should say, and keep you from doing things that shouldn't be done, right? The idea is that the in this case the nurses in Zambia, was it, right? They are already, they want to do good things, and they need help doing it, right? So the second thing is you mentioned almost as an aside, that the pay was the same, right? And one of the things I find most, here in the UK, we're in the midst of an election campaign, right? And what I hear, and what you hear, and what everyone who pays any attention to politics hears all the time, is how constrained this government is, whoever the next government is, fiscally, right? How little money there is available, right? And, raising people's pay can also make them more satisfied and be a motivator. I'm not suggesting it can't. But raising pay costs, everyone would agree, money, right? A change in management approach doesn't necessarily. In fact, to the extent it might involve sort of lessening some of the compliance burden, it can actually save money, right? And so this is an approach which is available whatever a government's fiscal position might be. And, the example you tell in Zambia, there's so you mentioned Balochistan before, and so, the work that brings to mind is this wonderful work by an economist named Yasser Khan, who's at University of Pittsburgh, right? And what Khan finds is, it's a randomized control trial, and in one arm of the trial, in Balochistan, public health workers, community health workers, are given more money. They're given a pay-for-performance scheme where more home visits leads to greater pay, right? In the other arm of the trial, they have 3 meetings with other community health workers where they listen to a recorded message from, I believe it's a district supervisor, right? And then they have a conversation about why they do the work they do, right? And so in the arm where people are paid for home visits, you'll be unsurprised to learn they engage in more home visits, right? Okay. They do. Paying people for home visits leads them to visit homes, right? But of course, we don't actually care about the home visits. We care about the health of the children in the end. And that we can also monitor, right? That we can also evaluate. And in the medium term, right, the children who are cared for by community health workers who receive the kind of mission treatment, right, the peer engagement, the kind of why are we doing the work treatment, those people end up leading to better, healthier children than does the pay-for-performance scheme, right? So one scheme costs a lot of money. One scheme costs very little, having a couple meetings. The scheme that costs very little money does better. Why does it do better? Well, it does better because these workers want to feel a sense of mission, a sense of purpose. It also does better because it helps actually alter their motivation. So another thing that is sort of part of the model in the book, and I think we have very good evidence is true, though is under-recognized, it's not so much that they're like good bureaucrats and bad bureaucrats, good humans and bad humans, right? So Dolly Parton once said, some of us are saints, some of us are sinners, but for all the rest of us, it sure does depend, right? And I think that's right. And most people are all the rest of us. It sure does depend, right? And people are not fixed types. People can become more motivated. They can become more dedicated to the mission. We look at a bureaucracy full of people not working and we say, this is a bunch of unmotivated people. But a fair number, often a majority of the people who are unmotivated are, it seems, in fact, demotivated, right? And if a change in management practice can yield changes in their behavior.
Yeah, that's definitely what I saw in Zambia. Dan, do you think it's time that we should have a segue about American team sports? Because that seems like another...
I mean, yes, of course. Just what was on my mind. American team sports.
That seems like
I'm going to grab my water, yes.
That seems like another example where camaraderie is so important, right?
Totally. Well, and I mean, and also on changing things. So I put this in the book, actually. So when I first showed up in London 3 years ago, from time to time, people would ask me if I was doing an impression of Ted Lasso, right?
Oh, right.
Who's
Yeah,
a
you love
fictionalized
this. You love
American. I was so, which caused me to go watch Ted Lasso,
Right.
which is a lovely program.
Yeah.
Highly recommend. But at some point in this fictionalized
Yes.
football, right, football show, they changed tactics, right? And, basically Ted Lasso, who's a kind of like empowerment-oriented coach, right? He says, and I should say both the actor and the character are from the Midwest, the same region I hail from. So,
There's an
proud
affinity. Yes,
to be confused in this way. So, the team changes tactics, right? And they change tactics to a system called total football that really empowers each of the players and requires a lot of trust, right, between those players. And, one of the characters kind of, it seems to me, voicing the purpose, voicing the message, right? A journalist says, Ted, I've realized you didn't just change tactics today. You've changed it over the last few years. You've changed it all the way along the way as you've changed kind of the behaviors and understandings and relationships of the team. And, that's right. So, and that's true in Ted Lasso, that's true in team sports in general. We know that coaching matters. And we know that coaching can't just be, you did it wrong, you should hit the ball better, right? Or you're going to be fired if you don't perform better at this task, right? There needs to be support, there needs to be trust. Of course, talent matters too. I'm not saying anyone can become a world beater, right?
But I think football is a great example whereby, sorry to interrupt you, it's like a great example whereby it's like, if you feel proud of your team, if you want your team to thrive, that could be that empowering, that sense of collective efficacy could be so much more effective than I want to make sure that you touch the ball 20 times this match.
100%.
Can I make one more segue that's not in your book?
Sure.
But about one of the most important public sector organizations throughout world history.
Okay. Good. I should definitely have something to say about them in that case, wherever that.
Imperial armies, right? Imperial armies. And that's so much, I've just come from the British Museum exhibition on the Roman army. If you think about the glory of Rome, you're getting the troops, think about for the honor. And there's so much, if you go to any single museum across the world, there's always about the glory of military might. And you make military service a very proud thing. Men in the First and Second World War lay down their lives to fight for king and country, God, king and country. And by making workers feel that you're doing an important role, you're increasing their commitment.
100%.
I think the cultural aspect matters a lot. Now,
I think that's absolutely right.
Next question. Oh, yes. What can we learn from South Africa's post-apartheid reforms?
Yes. Before I go there, can I go back to the military for a moment?
Yes.
Is that all right? I just want to say, there's a lot. So for a time, I thought about writing something about kind of military organization and how it relates to these themes, right? We think of a military as a kind of peacetime military, right? Yes. As lots of drills, lots of rote, sort of structure and hierarchy. But of course, what happens in wartime, in the fog of war, is just the opposite. So all of that drilling is about creating a common understanding so that when we actually get into the fight, we have similar instincts and can communicate with each other and have trust and have a common language and a common understanding. And creating that common understanding amongst peers is so important to all sort of enterprises that seek to deal with uncertainty. And the military actually understands this much better than most of the rest of public services. Another organization that was quite good at this, where good means it was helpful in accomplishing its goals without talking about whether those goals were good or bad, is colonial administration, right? So, Colin Destin Moore has a wonderful PhD thesis about American colonial administration in the Philippines. And he points out that this ability to communicate across distance and this trust and this kind of empowerment of people was the only way you could go, right? When the Philippines was over here and America was all the way over here and it took days to communicate. Right. And in some ways, if we remembered the things we once knew about how to deal with uncertainty, right? Domestically, but also internationally, I think we would be a lot better off. So anyway, I'm happy to turn to South Africa.
South Africa, yes.
So what can we learn from post-apartheid South Africa? So one element of the book that we haven't really touched upon is the book contains a series of profiles of mission-driven bureaucrats, right? And one of these profiles is of a really, in my view, inspiring woman named Judy Parfitt. And Judy was the head of human resources for the South Africa Revenue Services immediately after apartheid, right? So she comes in with a larger leadership team led by the new commissioner of SARS, as it's called, Praveen Gordon, right? And what this leadership team needs to do is think about, well, so we have this institution. We have an organization which is largely populated by loyalists and sympathizers of the previous regime, of the National Front regime, which has now been deposed. How do we get them working for the new South Africa, for the new goals we have? You know, there's also a history of underperformance and very little performance, right? And, you know, you might imagine that the answer is fire all of them and hire new people, right? So I have to be honest, before I spoke to Judy, I might have advised such a thing, right? But instead, what this leadership team at SARS did is much the opposite. They oriented the existing workers towards a kind of new way of being and towards new goals, right? And, you know, almost all, it's not that there was no attrition, but there was very little attrition. The vast majority of workers, the overwhelming majority of workers, oriented towards this new mission point, towards you know, and it became one of the highest performing agencies in government. I mean, if I could say, so this is in South Africa, but it echoes my own experience. So in my pre-academic life, I for a while was special assistant and then advisor to the Liberian Minister of Finance, and this was just after the war in Liberia. And there too, you know, my boss, Antoinette Saye, who's now a senior official at the International Monetary Fund, but at the time was the Minister of Finance of Liberia. You
have a lot of friends in high places, Dan.
I don't know about that. So Antoinette's a wonderful, wonderful human, and working for her was one of the honors of a lifetime, if I could say. And you know, what we found in this ministry, populated largely by appointees of the previous Charles Taylor regime, right? You know, we didn't need to wonder, had they come in because they were good folks? They hadn't, right?
Yeah.
So what we found again and again is that we could get better performance, not by attempting to monitor in ways that, frankly, we didn't have the systems to really do, but by empowering people. I'm not saying we took like Charles Taylor's, you know, senior financial officials and said, here's a discretionary budget of $1 million. But, you know, I found over and over that the best question I could ask was, what do you think? Right? Wow. So we'd be talking about something and I would say to some official, some member of the ministry, well, what do you think we should do? And, you know, I would get this reaction often that was like, no one's ever asked me that question before. And I would say, well, you know more about this than I. What do you think? How should we proceed? What's it going to take to get there? And, you know, you can see the light turn on. You can see people think, oh, it matters what I say and do, right? And that's exciting. As you said before, that's exciting. Whether you're on a football team or you're in Child Protective Services or in, you know, I don't know, internal audit. It doesn't need to be something that perhaps I would find inherently exciting. I'm sorry. What matters is that the person doing the job does. You know, one of these other profiles in the book is of the woman who led the census for the government of South Sudan in its first national census, right? And she says, even when God was creating, he must have used statistics. Numbers change people's lives, right? And, you know, what Labanya Margaret is getting at here is that for her, this data has so much meaning. That's why she did the job so well. And she did. The census was excellent. Yeah, let me stop there.
You know, one thing that I think two things comes across. One is that your belief in that things are malleable, that things can be changed, right?
Yes.
In Liberia and post-apartheid South Africa, two of the most difficult cases in the world. And I think what we're also saying repeatedly is that people want to feel valued. They want to feel like their worth matters. So it's not just about your pay. It's not just about the achievement. It's like, and I think we see it so often in so many domains. You know, I study religion, and like people may turn to religious activism, religious extremism, because they want to feel, especially economically struggling men who've got low status, they want to feel like they're doing God's work. Like that's something that gives you dignity, that gives you status, that gives you some kind of recognition of feeling important. And I think that's such an important thing, of feeling valued, that your manager wants to know what you think. that you're a person who's got an important perspective.
Totally.
And I think that's so important. Now, I previously shared with you this new paper that's come out that shows that they showed that women, no matter their position, no matter their pay, in a...
Relatively disempowered.
Yeah,
it's in France, yeah?
Was it France? Yes, I believe it was France, which is
Yes.
surprising because it's a relatively gender equal country, and yet they're subject to more compliance-based management. And I wanted to sort of push back. So, suppose you've got a bureaucracy which is a little bit sexist, which doesn't trust women, and so imposes more compliance-based management, or it doesn't trust people of a specific religion or racial or ethnic minority. And so if people are systematically biased, they trust them less, they want to impose more compliance management.
Yes.
Do you think that's still... How do you get around that situation?
I mean, wave a magic wand and make people not racist
Right,
and sexist.
right, yes, yeah.
So, and if that magic wand's not available, I think, you demonstrate that more compliance is undermining performance, right? So once you start looking for it, it's not hard to find and demonstrate this fact, right?
Okay.
What I would say is like, so, in my view, a lot of people who work on the public sector end the conversation with, and then public employees will be happier, right? After some intervention. And I think it's great if public employees are happier, but ultimately what I care about is the performance of the agencies,
yes.
right? And I think what we see over and over again is that constraints in this way are undermining that performance. And so I would try agency by agency to document the differential performance where we do have differences at the margin, right? So even two teams of women who in this hypothetical are not receiving as much compliance, right, are going to have different levels, right? And where there's more, is that associated with higher performance or lower performance?
But some people are so ideological that may trump the performance-based.
And
like you could come in and say, "Hey, your agent," if
you're
you were
undermining performance.
for example, here's a good example that you could go into India and tell their government that their very low rate of female labour force participation is holding back economic growth. If only 24% of women are working, then your very high dependency ratio, you're not benefiting from all that human capital, all that innovation is holding back economic growth.
Yes. And what do you do?
You can show people that there's a direct economic disadvantage from having
or performance disadvantage, and they still won't change.
And they won't change.
Of course. And so I guess I don't have a theory for, I think people often act, indeed, and I know you agree with this, it's one of the things you've written about at length, right? People often act not in their own instrumental best interests, right? And where they aren't doing so because of some deeply held belief, I don't have a kind of novel theory of how to change that belief. But I do think that oft people act believing that their ideological belief also is, in kind of instrumental terms, the best thing to do. Yes. And what I think I, as an academic, and we, as a sort of community dedicated to achieving the best possible, whether it's growth performance or welfare performance, what I think we can do is tackle that second part of the argument. And so does it affect the first part of the argument? No. Are there people who care enough? Are there voters in this country who voted in ways that were clearly not in their economic interests? I'm thinking, in Brexit terms, right? Sure. So, of course. Do I think, and some of them would say, well, I don't care about the economic disadvantages. I just don't want to be associated with Europe anymore. And if that's true, I unfortunately don't have a novel theory there. But I do think there's more in the second category than we often credit. It's a little bit, think of it as a cousin of your work on pluralistic ignorance, right?
But there was so much, to take the Brexit example, there was so much campaigning about the economic disadvantages of leaving, and that seemed to do so little.
Because many people don't care, perhaps. And if they don't, I can't make them care. So I guess this book and my work in general is not in the world of like changing people's values.
I accept that.
And so,
but you can accept there are some things that we can't change and some things that we might be able to change.
I mean, there's my understanding of I'm not Christian myself, but my understanding is that the Serenity Prayer, right? Which is, so it's commonly needle-pointed in my region of America, right? So many people over their kitchen have this in needlepoint, right?
Okay.
And it's true. It's true. I know it sounds dubious,
Okay,
but the prayer goes, God grant me the strength to change the things I can, accept the things I cannot, and the wisdom to know the difference, right?
Okay.
And I think there's a lot
Maya
in the can.
Angelou said something similar.
Oh, yeah?
She said,
Okay.
She said, if you don't like it, change it, and if you can't change it, change your attitude.
100%. 100%.
that.
Maya Angelou. I mean, the question is, has anyone needle pointed? Because until it goes into needlepoint, that's the issue. Maya Angelou, more needlepoint. So,
Okay.
but I just want to say one thing on this, which is, I think those of us who study political and economic systems, right? We often focus on the boundaries, right? We often focus on what can't change and where politics or values get in the way. And those boundaries absolutely exist. But I guess I don't think we're anywhere near that frontier.
Yeah, okay. No.
And I think we're all the way on the interior, and I want to push us out to that boundary.
Perfect. Okay, now I want to talk about cross-country differences.
Okay.
Which countries would you say have the most empowering style of public management, and why?
That's a really good question. So I would say this is anecdotal. This is observation, right? So I would say the two countries where I've seen the most empowerment. So one is probably not that surprising, which is Singapore, right? So maybe it is surprising, right? So a place where bureaucrats are highly paid, highly empowered, right? Where it is it attracts the best and brightest, and where thinking about the medium term and what is going to be useful is a kind of culture, right? So, people aren't worried for whatever reasons, we know some of them, about what's going to be delivered in 6 months, right? What they're interested in is what is going to make the system focus.
So it's not a compliance-based system?
I mean, I would say so, there's a huge amount. So there's this thing called the Global Survey of Public Servants, right, which is available online, and some friends of mine, we're part of launching, including Dan Roger and Christian Schuster, who's one of my colleagues here at UCL. And so the Global Survey of Public Servants suggests that there are, on almost any variable we can think about, substantial cross-country differences, but also substantial within country agency level differences.
Right. Yes.
And so and very frequently the greater variation is at the agency, not the country level. Right.
Okay.
So I guess I say that here by way of saying I don't think Singapore is X, right? And the UK is Y per se.
Right, okay.
But I think on average, yes, Singapore combines a sort of, so we've been talking about compliance and empowerment as stylized 0-1s, but one thing I try to make clear, as in the book, is that really it's a range, right?
So
it's
that's
degree
so
of
interesting, because if you're saying there's more variation within country than across country, you're saying that the biggest drivers of bureaucracy are not a national culture, which would be fairly set in stone, or not a national political economy, which is fairly set in stone, but actually maybe there is a lot more malleability. Maybe that's why you see so much variation.
I agree. So I think that's exactly what I'm saying. I will say that I don't actually know the thing you just said, right? Okay. So on kind of empowerment versus compliance, right? I think we would need a lot more work to establish cross versus intra-country variation. Okay. But I will say I have never worked or been in a country where I did not see substantial variation here at the agency level. Or, I mentioned Erin McDonald once just in the opening. She has this wonderful book, which you probably know, called Patchwork Leviathan.
Oh, yes.
Which is about pockets of effectiveness in the same agency,
yeah.
right? So you've got a single agency, and some of the places in the agency are being managed differently than others. And that's because managers are taking differential approaches, right? So
that does really show the importance of management leadership, and you can just, if you have a good manager somewhere, they could change things. That's such a Dan Honig point.
Well, thanks. It is. I mean, construction, Dan Honig made it. But I mean, and I totally. I want to say good manager. So sometimes when to the malleability point you made before, sometimes we talk as if good managers are sent from heaven, right? And all you got to do is parachute one in, right? But good managers, of course, thrive and grow in systems too. Yes. And of course, the more of a kind of, the broader the equilibrium can be,
Yes,
right?
yes.
The more kind of reinforcement of peers. And
Okay, what are those
we'll get to.
reinforcing factors? Like, what kind of political economy systems do you think support more empowering management? Like, Singapore's clearly a case where the whole country is very much about long-term visions and, you know, they have the same things, you know, they also pay their politicians a very high salary. You know, they've
Yes.
got that whole ethos going.
So say more about what you mean. What's a political economy system in this definition?
Okay, so for example, some countries like Egypt, for example, might be known for very high levels of cronyism, of wasta, of people hiring their connections. And you could imagine, and that could lead, whereas in China, for example, if we look at our mutual friend Wenwei Ang's work about how Chinese local level bureaucrats being given these incentives to achieve certain goals, and they improve their position in the bureaucratic hierarchy by, for example, reducing social instability and raising growth, for example.
Yes.
And once they think that certain ideas are greenlit, and then their peers have done similar things, they go for those. So if you have like a political economy system whereby certain things are green lights and you've got certain structures.
Yes. So I think, so this again is pushing us back towards cross-country differences, right? So, and I think the factors you're talking about are heterogeneous, are vary both across country and within country, right? So, so let's take cronyism, which you talked about, right? So you probably know already this work by Guillermo Torrell in Brazil, right? So Guillermo has work that shows that in a particular setting in Brazil, patronage appointments lead to higher performing bureaucrats. Why is that? So Guillermo argues, hopefully I'm getting this right, that in this particular setting, the people who I appoint through patronage, right, feel other connections to me other than the formal accountability system and thus work harder, right? So Jeff Weaver has a wonderful paper in which he shows that in a I believe anonymized country in Africa, in a particular public health role, the people who when we kind of allow a system of bribes for promotion to occur, that leads to better selection. Why does it lead to better selection? Because the people who have a higher willingness to pay are, all things equal, the people who care more about the job, right? And
Really?
so
Is that really true that they care more?
that's
It's not their ability to pay?
their ability to pay. So conditional on having a similar, so of course people have different abilities to pay, right? But it's also the case that my desire to pay as a function of my interest is that, so imagine we have similar-ish salaries or similar-ish, and we're being promoted from the prior position. So at least in terms of our salary income, we have similar salaries previously. Of course, we could have different assets, different family connections, etc. So, you know, I'm not suggesting by any means that it would be a good idea for people to always pay for jobs or even often pay for jobs, nor am I suggesting that patronage appointments are a great idea. But I mean to suggest that the reason people feel a sense of mission, right, and what it means is very much like I am a little bit allergic to sort of like X system is bad, Y system is good. I think what we want to do in each case is look at the people in the organization and think, why are they doing what they're doing and what could help them do better stuff. And, you know, do I think, so I certainly think systems that are steeped in top-down accountability are going to be harder for mission-driven bureaucrats to thrive in. And I think to the extent that, you know, reporting up and delivery down are often in tension in this way.
Is it possible that some people could have different values and like or are accustomed to that top-down hierarchy? So earlier this year I was in South Korea, which is a very hierarchical system where you count out to the... Do you think there's evidence that in such kind of hierarchical environments, people also support empowerment cultures?
Yeah.
I mean, you talk about Thailand, for example.
Yeah, so Thailand, so let me stick with Korea before I go to Thailand, if I could. So I think, you know, so first let me say that, you know, in Korea or, you know, Kalamazoo, Michigan, or someplace that starts with a K here, which is what I was trying to go for. So, or you know, Kirkwood, UK, right? So we will find...
UK geography!
And we would, I'll take it. So we will end up there will be some people who prefer hierarchy and some people who do not want open-ended, judgment-laden jobs, right? And there, I think the answer very much is like different strokes for different folks, right? So, some people, some tasks really will thrive with a great deal of compliance, and some people will thrive with a great deal of compliance. And what we should be trying to do effectively is match, right? So do I think that in certain countries, the proportion of people who prefer one thing or another is likely to be different, right? I think that's also extremely plausible. But since you started in Korea, right? So, in Korea and in Japan, which is another similarly hierarchical culture, right? These are, in fact, are examples of judgment-laden, growth-empowering bureaucrats, right? So you think about Robert, is it Chalmers' work on MIDI and the Japanese Innovation Agency. There's similar work in Korea. Atul Kohli has a wonderful chapter, or maybe set of chapters in his book State-Directed Development about Korea, right? Yes. And what these suggest is that these are countries where at least some bureaucrats have been exercising judgment in a structure with wonderful results.
Yes,
huge results.
For sure.
And both those authors make clear, it seems to me, that systems that were very compliance laden would have, it's not the point of their chapters, but compliance-laden systems would not have been compatible with achieving these goals.
No, so that's a great example, Atul Kohli's chapter, because that really was navigating by judgment and yes,
and empowering management. And so,
for sure,
how frequent it is, I don't know. I'm no expert on Korea, right? So, to Thailand, where you talked about, so I have some original empirical work in Thailand, which is in the book, and in Thailand, what I find effectively is that elite level politics and what's happening in Bangkok has essentially become decoupled from what is happening in Thai districts. So Thailand has 700 plus districts. This is like the fundamental unit of delivery. Delivery is extremely hierarchical on paper, right? But in practice, the people who are in Thai districts face a kind of information asymmetry, right? So people in Bangkok don't know what they're doing except by asking them, right? And they face very little career concern, right? So in the sense that, for a typical job, let's say a district community health officer, right? So that job might have 3 or 4 positions to which it can be promoted in Bangkok, right? And of course, if you get promoted, you're going to be the junior most person in Bangkok rather than being the senior most person in the district, able to control your own agent. So very few people want that job. And even if they wanted it, the ratios are bad, right? 700, 3, and only when someone moves is one of those 3 available, et cetera. And so, these bureaucrats at the district level end up with quite a large degree of effective autonomy. And this is sort of understood by the hierarchy, but not kind of explicitly acknowledged, right? And, these bureaucrats in the field, so I think we find that something like 50% of them report frequently adapting or refusing orders from above, right? And adapting can mean things like the program was meant for purpose X, and I thought it was better off that it would be used for purpose Y.
And people tolerate that, that's fine.
I mean, I don't know that there's a reason we anonymize the districts, right? So I don't know that specific actions would be tolerated if identified. But I do think there's a huge span of control problem. And, when you look at Thailand, I mean, stepping back, Thailand's a country, I'm not going to get the number right, but with dozens of coups and changes of government in the past, in the past 30, 40 years, right? It's also a country with incredibly consistent development progress, right? Yeah. HDI, Human Development Index, life expectancy, economic growth, right? It has some of, frankly, the most boring development graphs in the world. The lines just go steadily up or steadily down, whatever development means in that context. And, how do you get this consistent performance despite all of this political churn, which in any system should be leading to changes in priorities? Well, because the delivery system, I find highly satisfied, highly empowered bureaucrats on the ground. And when I say highly satisfied, so it's not nationally representative, but if we imagined it was for a second, and I compared it to that global survey of public servants I mentioned before, I believe they come out as the second most satisfied group of bureaucrats in the world.
Wow.
Right?
So, get me a job in the Thai public sector.
Yes.
Okay.
Something you didn't expect to say. You didn't, when you woke up this morning, you did not expect to hear that. So there it is.
Question. So you say in the book, and I quote, when monitoring is challenging, the mission motivation of employees matters even more for performance. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so let's take that postal delivery, that I was talking about before, right? Or, you know, if we're going to stick with
Because
health.
also the other one I liked was Imran Rasool and Dan Honig work on Nigeria and corruption.
Yes. So Imran Rasool and Dan Honig have a paper in Nigeria, and then they jointly with Martin Williams have a wonderful paper in Ghana, which are very similar themes, which basically show that the more you engage in I'm going to call it managing for compliance, the worse the performance, right? With increasingly bad performance as tasks become harder to kind of monitor and measure, right? And that, you know, I think they put it more clearly in the Ghana paper, right? So Russell, Roger, and Williams, they say something along the lines of, you know, when tasks are harder to monitor, there are greater returns to autonomy and the exercise of, I believe they put in terms of discretion. Exercise.
I think that's so important.
Discretion.
Right? And that's totally contrary to the conventional wisdom.
Yeah, so what do you mean by that, by conventional wisdom? What do you see?
Well, because I think most people would say, when you're very worried about corruption, you want to hammer down every nail.
Totally. And in that sense, like, you know, so if I'm honest, Nigerian bureaucrats working on infrastructure projects would not have come to mind as one of the populations that I most would have expected to be appropriate to empower, right? But the basic, so like, to the question you asked, right? So we're focused on trying to pound down every nail, but we can't actually do that, right? So the problem is we don't have the right hammer or the right nails, and if, in my view, we've spent 20 years trying to develop them. And guess what? And you know, compliance-oriented management has delivered a lot, right? So though our conversation has focused on its failings, in the book I try to make clear that there are real benefits to this system. And it has solved real problems. But we are left with a whole slew of problems it has not solved. And just a little bit more is unlikely to do it because the nature of the tasks is such that we can't get it done. You know, what I was about to say at the outset was like, if you were delivering a vaccine, right, that is something we can put a GPS chip on and we can track, right? And that compliance-oriented management might not feel good for the vaccine deliverer, but it's likely to work pretty well in my view. Right? But if
it's what Amazon uses.
It's what Amazon uses. That's why I went to package delivery, right? So I pulled out, I thought, oh, where's my package yesterday? And I pulled up the app, and it is now the case that it told me it is 2 stops away, and it showed me the gentleman it turned out to be walking, and I was like, wow, I am disturbed but also impressed, and I will stay for 5 minutes so I can receive the package before I go out. It's great, right? Might not be good for the delivery man, right? But it's great for the performance of the task. But if what we're delivering is not vaccines, but rather child protective services or, you know, psychosocial counseling or holistic child nutrition and development, to Yasser Khan's work, we just can't get the monitoring right enough. And, you know, the way I put it in the book is that where monitoring is great, compliance is a great way to go. But for most of the things government does, it is good but not great. You know, let me say one more thing on this, which is to go back to that Ghana paper, right? So there's this wonderful figure in Russell, Roger, and Williams where they have RAs, they have research assistants code all the tasks that are reported on in Ghana, right? So Ghana uses a standard performance reporting format. So whatever you're delivering, you sort of have a goal and a performance report and what you're planning to achieve and what you then achieved. And they ask people, ex ante, is it clear what success looks like for this task? Do you know what success is going to look like? And ex post, do you know it's happened if the good thing has happened, right? And a vanishingly small percentage of tasks, I want to say somewhere in the 15 or 20% range, end up with above a 4 on a 5-point scale. And you need ex ante and ex post. You need to know what a good performance looks like and know what good performance was, right? I expected to get a package, that's good performance. The package came on time and I was happy with it. That's ex post delivery, right? So those things need to be really, really high for compliance to be the core of an accountability system. But most things the public sector does it is not that high for. Yet we have made this kind of compliance-based accountability the center of what it is to manage.
All right, so we've got these very strict directives about targeted quantitative outcomes when it's not necessarily those targeted preset outcomes that really matter to every single person. Okay, I'm with you.
Or the rules, but we can't monitor what compliance with the rules are, right?
Yeah, I'm with you. Okay, so now I want to push back. So you have this argument that if you manage for empowerment, then the people will come. But I wonder if there are many cases where maybe management style doesn't affect that recruitment that much because people don't have better options.
Sure.
So in Northern England, going back to Gateshead, the public sector is a major employer because there's economic stagnation and you don't have many options. In India, I just watched a fantastic Indian Bollywood film, 12th Fail, which I recommend to everyone, 12th Fail, and it's all about, so many Indians, they're retaking these government civil service exams because
12th Fail for the test.
They're taking these exams because they just want a government job. Sure. And there are so many people who just want a government job, not because they're necessarily like public spirited, I want to, change Indian education system, though that one guy does exist. One guy, the one star of the show, Manoj, he is committed. He wants to create an honest system. He wants to overturn corruption. And I'm sure people like Manoj exist all over the world. But there are many, many people who just don't have that many better options, whether you're in Gateshead or Delhi, and they just want a government job. And so to what extent does management style matter when the people will come anyway because you don't have better options?
So management in that case, so first, totally agree. There are absolutely cases where we have so many applicants for so few positions.
Yes.
So, in Indian civil service, I think it's like 1,000 or thousands to one, right? In terms of who's selected.
It's the most competitive thing in the world.
Yes. Yes. Very, very competitive, right? So in that situation, of course, the management practices might change. If now 1,000 people apply, maybe if we change management practices, 1,100 people apply for every job. But we all have more than enough, right? So there, I don't think it matters on the way in, though I think something else does, which I'll come back to. I think it still matters for what happens once those people come in and for whether they stay. So, I have done some work in India. I have collaborators in India on sort of my next set of projects on relational state capacity. And those... I have met a number of senior civil servants who say, I am looking to leave because of the compliance culture here, right? And take my skills and knowledge away. So, but on the way in, so if we have 1,000 people applying for every job, fantastic, right? The question is, what are we going to do? What are we going to select on, right? And the way the Indian civil service exam works currently, it selects on scores, right? But the person who is just above the threshold and the people just below are all real smart, right? The difference is on the test they had one different question on the day, and if it was different they could have had a different test. And it's what I've come to call a thin meritocracy, right? It's a meritocracy in the sense that it is about performance, but it is looking at what performance and future predicted performance is extremely thinly, right? If instead we use the fact that 1,000 people are coming in by saying, okay, what do they want? What kind of people are they? Are they mission motivated? How to do that at a scale of the Indian civil service, I don't have a good solution for.
But this is precisely what they do in 12 Fails. So this guy Manoj wants to be an IPS officer. So first of all, he does one test, the prelims, then he does the mains, and then they have an interview. And in the interview, it comes out that he is so mission motivated.
Yeah, totally.
And the group
I should watch this movie. I'm sorry I haven't seen it.
And the group of 5 assessors, one of them say to them, this is precisely the person he really wants to change the system. And that's the whole point of the film, that you want people like him. Totally.
There's another profile in the book.
And it's based on a true story, Dan.
I love it. I will see this movie.
Okay.
There's this woman named Uma Mahadevan who's in the state level cadre in Karnataka, right? Okay. And she talks exactly this way about how hiring is very much just on kind of thin merit and doesn't incorporate the Manoj is the gentleman's name, the Manojs of the world, and so I think that is kind of the Indian case. Let me also say, sometimes we hide our problems through selection mechanisms which exist, which work because of broader societal inequalities. So what I have in mind here is teachers in America, right? So in many communities, including the religious Jewish community from which I come, for a long time, capable women, in some ways being a school teacher was the highest socially acceptable job that they could aspire to, right? And my family is full of incredibly capable women who were school teachers, right? today, they wouldn't have to be school teachers, right? Today, because of what I see as, I know we agree on this, so we have both made incredible progress on gender equality, and there is a lot to go, and we should keep working on it, right? We should not rest on our laurels. But because of the progress to date, today, women in those positions do not have to settle for being school teachers, in the sense that they can do many other things. And that positive change in society means, I think, that is related to the kind of increasing crisis of recruitment for some jobs that used to have sufficient recruitment, right? Because now people have outside options. And so just because we have 1,000 applicants today for every job, just because I hope someday that Northern England sees the kind of economic dynamism as it should, and when that occurs, you're not going to have so many applicants for every public sector job. And that's a good thing.
I want to talk about another issue. So we're talking about, workers feeling that they're making a difference. And there's been one systematic change worldwide that makes this more difficult, and that's a loss of public trust. So many surveys show that people are losing faith in government. And this can be jeopardizing citizen mobilization for improved services, because if you don't think that your mobilization will make a difference, you don't go out and protest, you don't write letters, you don't petition. But also, if individual people don't believe that bureaucracies can make a difference, then they themselves may not apply for this job. So I think in order to cultivate mission-driven bureaucrats, people need to gain trust or gain a sense of collective efficacy that governments can change things. And of course, that's even more of an issue in the US, where people have very low faith and confidence in public services.
I agree. Let me say, I think I could tell the other story in the reverse causal direction.
Okay.
And let me try it that way.
Go for it.
Right? Which is to say, when we have bureaucracies that manage for compliance, that preclude, as I mentioned earlier, judgment exercising bureaucrats from being able to serve citizens, to meet citizens where they are, I think that also contributes to the distrust you're talking about, right? So I think you're right that we're in a kind of, I don't know if it's quite a vicious cycle, right? But it's definitely a low level equilibrium, right? Where we have low levels of public trust and cynicism about the power of the state to do anything. And management in the state that justifies that cynicism and that distrust, right? So, we were talking before, what can we change? Where are the margins of intervention? So if we could wave a wand and increase public trust, I would be in favor of that. In the absence of having some other trust-based intervention like that, I would say let's start on the bureaucracy side, right? So let's make the state able to serve citizens where they are in a way that rebuilds that trust. So people have trust. So this connects a bit to, I mentioned it in passing, my next set of work, which is on relational state capacity. So the idea there is like the capacity of the state to deliver is not just about its technical abilities, but also about the relationships between citizens and state agents, right? And where there are stronger relational contracts, right? Where there are stronger relationships there also is going to be a kind of greater latent ability to deliver on novel challenges like COVID, right? Or AI risk or climate change, etc. But there's also going to be a kind of increase in the sense that the state is out there to help me, the citizen, to support me, right? And, where we can empower bureaucrats, I think we can start to rebuild that trust. And I think that's one of the important reasons to do it. So to me, the constraints we put on the management system are indeed a result of our understandings of the bureaucracy, but also further cause them. And that's why the last chapter of the book is dedicated to how we as citizens and as, sort of voters in many countries, how we sort of are part of the problem here, right? The way we react to public governance or malfeasance ends up creating a accountability environment
for sure.
that has to focus on minimizing the risk of anything going visibly wrong, even when minimizing that risk means leaving a lot of value on the table.
Yeah, but part of I'm with you, but isn't part of what's driving low trust is, media coverage of, say, these terrorist problem, but there's one case where something terrible happens,
Totally.
and that splashes across all the headlines, and people may be thinking, we don't want that terrible, terrible, terrible thing to happen, and that's why we need the compliance-based management, right?
Totally. And that's exactly the kind of thing I talk about in that chapter, right? So, the example I give is, so let's imagine, it's a hypothetical, but let's imagine a reform where we gave 100 principals in schools. Could be UK, could be Guatemala, could be East Timor, where I used to work, could be anywhere, right? So you give 100 principals more fiscal autonomy, right? More ability to spend money. Let's say 95 of those schools end up spending the money in ways that help students perform better.
Yeah.
Let's say 3 of them spend the money in ways consistent with the procurement rules, but they make no difference, right? There's no net effect.
Yeah.
And let's say 2 of them steal £1,000.
Yes.
Right? What do we think the headline's going to be?
Yeah.
Right? And that's what I mean when I say how the public reacts. So as long as we react to that setup,
I'm with you.
by calling that a failure and by saying, hey, if 2 people can steal £1,000, let's destroy the program. I'm not saying we should let those 2 people continue to be principals.
Yes.
We should punish them as we do for any malfeasance, right? But the instinct we often have that if the oxygen of discretion has led to any bad action, we should always remove that oxygen. Well, that just suffocates us. It suffocates our public services.
Okay, I have another critical question.
Yes.
Okay, if compliance is bad management, why do we see the private sector using it so much? Sarah O'Connor at the Financial Times has a great piece on how employers are increasingly using online surveillance mechanisms to check that people are doing their work when they should be. It's like the 21st century equivalent of checking in.
Yeah. So I think, and the question is why they do it if it's not useful.
So if the private sector was doing something that wouldn't work, they'd go out of business. But yet we see the private sector doing a lot of compliance-based management.
Okay, so I agree the private sector does a lot of compliance-based management.
Okay.
First, I think the literature on organizational behavior and management, right, does not support the idea that all bad management leads to firms going out of business. So firms, the fact that there are comparative studies of firm management that show differential performance, right? So one of my favorite private sector management pieces, which I highly recommend, is this piece by Gibbons and Henderson. I want to say it's 2012. Sorry, Bob Gibbons and Rebecca Henderson, for getting the year wrong if I have, which is about persistent performance differences. That says basically, what is the difference in a sector? So over and over, we see in particular sectors that some firms perform a lot better than all other firms. And the difference very, very frequently is something about managerial culture. And they argue something about the strengthened relational contracts inside the firm, which I think is not 0% correlated with management for empowerment.
Yeah.
Right? So, most of those firms are managing suboptimally in that example. They still exist and they persist to exist. That's what makes the performance difference persistent. It is not the case, I don't think, that we see optimized management always or even very frequently in the private sector. That said, I do think the private sector thinks more carefully about management than the public sector to its as a kind of first pass, to a kind of first approximation. So
you have the nice example of Netflix.
Yes.
I like Netflix's procurement strategy.
Totally. So Netflix's procurement strategy is the book has it exactly right, but it's something like, do what is in Netflix's best interest. That's the procurement. So for all of us here in UK academia, if you've tried to get 72 quid, as a reimbursement, right? So do what is reasonable is a fantastic principle, right? So that is very far from where we are. So there's also the example in the book of a car plant, Detroiter, have to have a car example, right?
Now we got the transported.
Now we got the transportation, but it's cars. It's not really a public transit system.
But,
anyway, it's all good. So where the same set of workers worked for General Motors was terrible, right? Got rehired in a different managerial culture, right? A joint venture with Toyota called Numi, right?
Okay.
And the same workers, literally the same people, who were described by their own union representative as the worst workforce in North America, right? This is Fremont, California. They became one of the highest performing workforces in the country.
Okay, what did they do?
The people changed. you'll be unsurprised to learn, Alice, given my themes, that they empowered people, right? So they gave people a sense of purpose and a sense of pride and a sense of collective effort and a sense of ownership. So when people talk about the Toyota management system, they often talk about the Andine cord, right? The ability of any worker to pull the cord and stop the line, as if like just installing the cord is the thing. But what the cord is it's a symbol of we are all committed to quality and we are all in this together, right? You're not some replaceable functionary. What you said, it matters that it's me, right? It matters that I'm doing it, right? Because I care and I have skill and I exercise judgment. That's true on the line too. So I've wandered away. Let me come back to your actual question, which was, why is there so much monitoring?
In the private sector.
So I would say two things. So the first is from Frederick Taylor and his scientific management down. There has been a sort of important thread of private sector management, of management writ large, which says, let's monitor as much as we can, right? And my argument, indeed, is that sometimes that is efficient, right? Sometimes we should monitor as much as we can. And where that is efficient, we now have more and more tools to do it, right? So when you see somebody going from putting the camera in the factory to monitoring the keystrokes, right, for the remote worker, right, that is a greater compliance management, I agree, enabled by technology. Where managing for compliance is efficient, I'm not saying that's bad for performance, it might be good for performance, right? But also, I do think you see many cases of private sector firms that are sort of confusing the unmotivated and the demotivated, right? And I think, and
What's the unmotivated, demotivated?
Oh, right. So the unmotivated is somebody who couldn't do a good job in the absence of compliance management. And the demotivated who is somebody who requires compliance management because they are uncommitted to the job as a result of the managerial practices, right? So, my brother, right? So my brother, perhaps I should leave him anonymous lest I get him in trouble. So he works for a large, he does data stuff for a public sector entity in America, right? And he initially in his job had to face this kind of keystroke monitoring, what window is up, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, that's crazy.
And I witnessed my brother move from somebody who was, excited and indeed attracted to the mission of the organization to somebody who was just thinking about the compliance, right? So, because that's all the job was what he was being. And of course, there may hypothetically be ways to satisfy the compliance without doing the best possible job. And when you turn it into a game, right? When you show me you don't trust me at all, I am going to respond in kind. And that's the demotivating. It's disempowering. It's demotivating. And now I have an employee.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No.
But I think that's such a great point. That's such a great framing. The point is that I don't trust you, Dan. I don't think you're a sensible person. I don't think you'll work in the best interests of the company. I don't think you're clever. I don't think you're competent. So I need to tell you what to do.
Right.
Because I think less of your judgment. And it's the exact opposite of what we were previously saying is so important, where you feel valued.
And when you show that to me, do you think I'm going to go above and beyond? No. And then you say, well, Dan's the kind of person who will never go above and beyond. And that's right for you. I will not go above and beyond for you. Because, so in possibly the single thing I like to quote the most, right? A American politician named Henry Stimson, in resigning after serving many decades for Republicans and Democrats and being a cabinet secretary, like a minister, in 4 different ministries, right? He said, the chief thing I have learned in a long life of public service is that the best way to make a man trustworthy is to trust him.
Wow.
And the best way to make him untrustworthy is to distrust him and to show him that distrust, right? So people are not trustworthy or not.
Yes.
People are trustworthy to others based on their experience and understanding of what the others expect.
In that each specific relationship. And I think that's such an important point. And I want to give one more illustration of this. So I was interviewing a young man in Uzbekistan who'd been...
As one does, right, sure. Weren't we all? Sure. Tashkent, I was there Tuesday. I was not.
Anyway, so he'd been to 2 different schools. And the first school he went to was this private sector school, and
there was a great deal of freedom, and he got really into photography, and he was putting pictures up on his wall, and he was being creative. The second school that he went to was this government school, which was extremely draconian. They would check how long your hair was. There were such strict rules. Everything was rule governed, and he just lost all that creative drive. I mean, that's a separate point. It's just the level of repression, the level of just nitpicking within a school just destroyed his zeal.
There's actually a terrible song about this named, so it's by a 70s singer named Harry Chapin, most famous for the song Taxi, which is like, he's riding in the taxi. Anyway, you should listen to Taxi or not. Okay. But he has a different song which is called Flowers Are Red. And the story of the song is that like a child is in a school and that child says, flowers can be any color. And the teacher says, no, flowers are red and green leaves are green. And nothing should be any other way than the way they always have been seen, or something like that. And over time, he starts to adopt this behavior. Then he goes to a school where more creativity is allowed, right? And he then will only paint red flowers and green leaves, right? And the idea is like once people have internalized this kind of uncreative approach, it is very difficult to build them out of it. And, to something I encounter all the time, right? So in the book, I have this case, anonymized case, so I will keep it anonymized, right? Where you mentioned, so there is a link here to navigation by judgment in that, my prior book, in that navigation by judgment was also about the advantages of empowerment, though specifically in aid agencies working on different projects, et cetera, right? So, and I was speaking to somebody who said to me effectively, he said, look, when I first came here, the people who worked here, they're the kind of people I could have empowered. But now, the staff I have now, I don't know. I'm not sure I would empower them. And, I think that gentleman was wrong twice. So the first thing I think he's wrong about is let's pretend he's right about the current staff. Well, what you need then are different staff. And how are you going to attract and retain different staff? It's not going to be through a system that monitors every keystroke, right? But the second way I'm pretty sure he's wrong is what I've seen again and again in my professional work with agencies is that to say it again, we confuse the unmotivated and the demotivated. That the manager, well-intentioned managers, right? If you or I were a manager trying to do good, when we see people not working, we think, well, that must be a feature of them, not us, right? It can't be a feature of the managerial environment. I'm working really hard at being the best manager I can be. And so those must be people who can't work hard, right? But if we change the system, they will change. That change, though, is going to be slow, right? So it's not the case that, like, I change the managerial environment and tomorrow all of those people are going to just, like, like the child in the song or the Uzbek student, rapidly change. They have internalized the idea that it doesn't matter what I do, right? My actions, something higher up will happen. No one cares, ultimately, and no one can make a difference. And what often happens, so one of the things I study, or rather I use the data of in the book, is something called emerging public leaders who have fast stream civil service programs, a bunch of countries in Africa. And, what the EPL data, what their evaluation data suggests is that when a fast stream civil service intake person, right? So when a motivated young person comes in, the kind of stylized case would be they're coming into a unit where people haven't seen that their actions really amount to anything. And there's a great deal of cynicism about that new entrant. But as that new entrant starts to do things and people can see the results of that thing, people slowly change their behaviors, right? That peers who observe somebody being agentic and having that actually have meaning, right? And having that have results, start to do more. And that, how does a culture change? Well, it changes one person at a time. It changes slowly. But the first thing that it needs is like an instantiation claim, an instance of something working, of somebody trying to make things better and things actually getting better as a result. That's how we changed the Uzbek kid. That's how we changed Harry Chapin's hypothetical student. And that's how we change bureaucrats.
Okay, I want to make 2 segues.
Okay.
One to the industrial
takeaways.
One to the industrial revolution, the other to the emergence of modern art.
So
Okay. All right. I'm gonna choose at least one of these two. Once I get it. Yeah.
You may know Joel Mockier's wonderful book, The Enlightened Economy.
I don't.
Dan, you must read it because it's all about cultures. It's about the savants fabricants, so the people who are knowing, also connecting to the people who are doing, and it's all about these circles, these enlightenment cultures where men are cheering innovations and they're supporting and celebrating each other. So
Is this in France? Are we
so
in France?
this is in sort of Anglo Enlightenment. No, in Europe, the European Enlightenment in America. You have people who are interested in innovation. Then people make a gas meter, and others are cheering it. So you have all these scientific clubs, all these historical clubs, and they're saying, "Wow, you've made an electrical,
Toaster.
Yes, you've made something fantastic. That's brilliant." And they're cheering each other, and these people gain esteem and applause, and it's all about men cheering each other and saying bravo. Because if you're transitioning from a world that was focused on more religious piety to one that's more focused on secular progress and scientific advances, that's a cultural choice. That's a mission choice to be celebrating science.
Totally.
And so it wasn't just that people became scientists. It was these clubs where people were saying, "Hey, you go, Dan. Well done with your gas meter. That's fantastic."
Oh, thank you.
And they praise each other. They talk about each other. And I can draw another parallel with modern art. So around the early 20th century, Americans really had a strong financial demand for traditional European art. So they wanted, art from the old world that would look very grand in their new houses. But a lot of artists in France and elsewhere, they wanted to experiment. They were very individualistic. So people like, Impressionists or Cubists, they wanted to try new things. And the art market at that time was really not rewarding Impressionism or Cubism. Like that was, it doesn't look proper. It doesn't look like people. Sure. It's weird. People did not want it. A lot of these artists were very, very poor, but they were supporting each other. And they were like, "Hey, that's great." So someone saw an upside down woman with a wonky eye, one of Picasso's early work, and they thought, "Hey, Picasso, that's great."
Right.
Or whether it's Van Gogh or Matisse, all these people. So I think the modern art, the emergence of modern art, it was all about communities of struggling artists being like, "Hey, Dan, great mission," right?
So
anyway, I wanted to draw. I just think that the point about a community and even if the rest of the world don't value your worth, building these communities, whether it's the European Enlightenment or the emergence of modern art, it's getting these communities to say, "Damn, that's a great job." Because that's exactly what religions do. That's how religions thrive. They say, "That's great, that's fantastic, we're doing God's work." I think there's so much to learn from how religions empower each other and create a sense of brotherhood.
It's funny, I almost went there in response to a few questions ago about religions and brotherhood. But first I love that. Thank you. And I love those examples. So, to me, the modern art one really points up that, it takes a team, right? It takes a group of peers. And one of the easiest ways to kind of manage for empowerment without changing any of the rules at all is often to create those kind of peer networks and peer communities so that us together feel a sense of camaraderie and solidarity, right? Yes. So, your first example, right? So, I would say, I admittedly have only heard about this book mere minutes ago, right? But my understanding of the kind of innovation clubs and societies, I think of the ones in this country, Royal Historicals, or the sort of the groups that came together. What's that thing? It's just south of the Lady Di playground, over by Imperial. There's a Royal Innovation Society or something like that. So maybe, could be. So, but these kinds of groupings, right? They celebrated as a group of peers. They also there were also kind of awards and banquets and formal things, right? Yes. And this points up. So before, a couple times you used the phrase intrinsic motivation, right? And I used the phrase mission motivation. It's a little bit of a inside baseball point, which is why I didn't say it before. But, to me, the distinction is that if I'm working hard, in part because of being celebrated by others, that is an extrinsic reward, right? It is not money, but it is extrinsic. It's about the esteem of someone else. Yes. Recognition is extrinsic, right? And, the key to mission motivation for me is not whether it is, in fact, an intrinsic motivation. It's whether it's a motivation that needs a boss to monitor you to get it done.
Right.
And if it's about peer recognition and those peers can actually examine what you really did, right? Does the gas meter work?
Yes,
right?
yes.
You don't need a boss to make that gas meter happen. And that's the key. And so, you know, let me come to the third. So you talked about those two, and then, I'm sorry.
The art thing.
No.
And the enlightenment thing.
Art, enlightenment, and then you finished on something, on a third thing that I've lost. No? All right. Well, we'll move past that. Oh, religion. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And so I was going to say that, you know, a good friend of mine named Hari Han, who runs something called the Agora Institute at Hopkins, she has a fantastic book that I think you are going to love, and I've read large sections of coming out later this year, called Undivided, right? And what Undivided is in part about is about the organizing that happens in religious communities.
Oh, wow.
Right?
Amazing.
And what you were saying about sort of bringing your personhood to the job and it feeling important that you're there, right?
Yes.
And that it's you, right?
Yes.
She makes this point about what works in sort of megachurch and other religious organizing.
Nice.
And, you know, what's key to kind of people's active participation, as I understand it from her work, is, you know, so many of the forms of civic engagement that we engage in, right? So donating, voting, right, are fundamentally substitutable. If I give 100 quid to Labour right now, or you give 100 quid, we don't think it matters.
No,
I mean, it'd be better if we both did, but if it's going to be 100 quid, doesn't matter, right? You know, something that on the civic side asks you to bring yourself is also something that is more empowering, something that's more engaging. And why is that? Well, because you have autonomy, allowing autonomy. You get the sense that it matters that you have competence, right? And maybe you're even improving it, cultivating competence.
Yes.
And because it's creating connection to peers, other people who are doing it, and purpose, whether that purpose is religious, whether that purpose is delivery. And so, you know, this framework, which is steeped in sort of psychology, self-determination theory, is not about management per se. It's about what drives people to engage, right? And to engage in sort of action that leads towards whatever the goal is, whatever the mission is. And I think, you know, it's not a coincidence that the word mission, as we use it, as I use in the book, is derivative of the word missionary, right? The first missions were religious.
Yes.
And the Jesuits who sent people out on boats to, you know, distant Siam or whatnot, they knew that there was no monitoring technology. There's no compliance that's going to work. And so they built incredible... So it turns out there is a scholar of Jesuit accountability in missionaries. His name is... His last name is Quattrone. I want to say Paulo Quattrone. And, you know, what his series of writings show is how they built, across great distance, a kind of based accountability system. Anonymized letters where I could share how I was feeling and you could kind of respond to it, right? A sense of shared purpose even across great distance. And those connection to peers and purpose, that sense that it matters who I am and what I'm doing, that I'm not just an automaton. It's true for Jesuit missionaries. It's true for people participating in religious communities today. It's true for bureaucrats.
Let me add on to that. So, for example, the expansion of education in Africa was really started by African Christian missionaries. So they were so excited by the Christian faith that they then established their own churches and mission schools. So education in Africa, you know, there were very few there were very few English or French civil servants on the ground in Africa. Those education systems were spread by Africans themselves because they embraced the gospel, the book. And I think that's a great example of where you're so taken with the faith that you want to do, and that's really what you want. And you know, those people were not being monitored for their...
They couldn't be.
No.
How would you?
In the absence of technology, what really mattered was the mission. And I think this is such an important theme that you make so powerfully, Dan. It's about recognizing people's potential, having confidence in people, having confidence in their capacity to change, showing them that you value their judgment and letting them thrive, and letting an entire community thrive, and they can support each other to do so much more, and transforming
100%.
public sectors all over the world.
Thank you. I thank you. I'm very touched by that, and that's absolutely what I think. You know, one thing you said earlier, which is in the absence of technology, right? So I think there is a kind of bigger threat right now in the sense that it is easier to trick ourselves into thinking that compliance is working, right? So we have a more and more powerful flashlight of compliance because of the kinds of technologies we're talking about. And when we shine it and we see something, it is easy for us to delude ourselves into thinking that the flashlight caused the thing we're seeing. But in fact, the thing we're seeing might have been caused by what's happening in the shadows, right? By the kind of empowerment, by the lack of observation. And where that is true, I don't think we have the habit of mind of considering that possibility. It's not always true, but it's at least sometimes true. And I do think, as I think about where, AI and the increasing power of technology can go, technology can be an incredible force for empowerment. And it can be an incredible force for better management and understanding and reporting. But right now, I see example after example of technology rollout in governance, which is about increasing the strength of monitoring, as if that alone and unexaminedly will always make performance better. And one of the central implications of my book is it, at least quite frequently, is likely to make performance worse. And we need to set up systems to examine that as we roll out these technologies, lest we lose that.
I think that's a great point. So even though there have been massive advances in technology, we might think that could enable us to achieve our goals. Actually, what we need to understand is human motivations, the importance of feeling valued, the importance of feeling trusted. And we achieve that not through technology, but through empowering management.
I would say we achieve that through a use of technology that supports
yes,
that empowerment.
That is better put.
So it's not that technology is bad.
Yes,
it's that technology is
the final,
and the question is, technology is a tool. It's like screwdrivers and wrenches, right? What are we using it for? Well, if we're using those screwdrivers to, assemble a cabinet, probably a good idea. If we're using
a train.
Or assemble a train. Thank you. You've got transport in. And so if we're using it to do something that's inappropriate or that's likely to undermine performance, then no.
Professor Honig, thank you very much. Okay, Mission-Driven Bureaucrats is out now. This is Dan. He's great. And I look forward to seeing you on the 5th time on the podcast.
Thank you. I can't wait. Thank you so much, Alice.
My pleasure. Perfect.